We are very happy to have the opportunity to talk to our brother, James Coates. He is pastor of GraceLife Church in Edmonton, Canada. He is married to his wife, Erin, and father of 2 sons, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And we are very happy that to have you here. So it's great that you took the time to speak with us. We have been praying for you and your family and your church without ceasing over the last month. And therefore, it is a great pleasure and a great privilege for us to have this interview with you. So perhaps not everyone in Germany has noticed what has happened to you. So therefore, maybe we can start with the first question. Maybe you just start by telling us what exactly happened to you, what happened to your church.
Yeah, absolutely. We, like many, when the virus first arrived in Canada and our government took lockdown measures, we reluctantly complied with those measures and followed the capacity limits and things like that. And we did that because obviously, as the information came in, we were anticipating, an apocalyptic like virus that was going to, bring about a great deal of death and trauma to our culture and society. And so we did that. We also did that because there were threats in terms of fines for not complying with the orders. And we really didn't have a good handle on our legal system and how to think about those fines and that there is recourse to push back on them and that kind of thing. And so, we fell in line and complied, and we wrestled with the portions of scripture that most do, Hebrews 10, Romans 13, and there was a tension there for us. And on the one hand, we recognize that typically our responsibility is to be submissive to the governing authorities, but we also recognize that we're not to forsake the gathering of the saints. And so we modified our gathering to essentially be what I would say is not a gathering. We were in effect, we were not coming together corporately as a church, and therefore the gathering wasn't taking place. And as information rolled in and we wrestled with the ecclesiological implications of everything, and as we got into the science and the medicine and even the legal side of it, we came to the conviction at the end of the first declared public health emergency in Canada that we were going to open our church. And that was in June. And so we opened for a couple of Sundays, and then we ended up having a couple of cases that touched 2 Sunday gatherings where there was no transmission, but individuals who had been in our gathering ended up testing positive with a PCR test, which I would say is a very low credibility test for testing viral infection. And we came to realize that, as things progressed, but we opted at that point in time to go to live stream out of an abundance of caution. We just shut down for 2 Sundays to make sure that we weren't in this perpetual, spreading of the virus. And we had no transmission that had taken place, and we opened back up again. In fact, when we opened back up, it was just in God's providence the same Sunday the same Sunday following the announcement that John MacArthur had made with his statement and about the lordship and headship of Christ over the church and spheres of authority. And so we reopened our church, and then we're open for 37 Sundays in a row until we got kicked out of our building. Now, things were fine into July and August and September. Things were moving along just fine. But then when the second public health emergency was declared by our premier in November, that's when things started to heat up. And there's a community nearby that was apparently contacting AHS, which is our health authority, and making complaints about our gatherings. We weren't in compliance. We were fully open. We totally disregarded the restrictions on capacity limits and masking and social distancing. And when I say that, like, just leaving it to our people to decide. Like, we didn't force anyone to do anything. We just opened our doors and let our people decide. And so things began to heat up in December. We had the RCMP, which is our police force, attend our service along with an AHS officer. And on December 20th, I had come to the end of, I think, John 8, and it was sort of like, well, it's, you know, it's the Sunday before Christmas, and I'm not going to finish John 9 in one sermon. So it was a nice time to kind of break things up, and the heat was coming. So I thought, well, you know, it's time to address this issue head on. So I preached a sermon that I titled "The Time Has Come," which is like not a helpful title as far as like telling you what the sermon's about. But as I prepared the sermon, I just couldn't get away from that title. It was just like, for whatever reason, that title just kind of described what was going on in my mind and heart, and what statement was being made with that sermon. So I preached that sermon, and that really, I think, was the moment that in hindsight triggered the whole trajectory that we ended up on. That's when the government decided we need to silence that pastor and bring that church into compliance. And it was really interesting because the media began to report on us at that point in time. And that week, actually, there was an excerpt from that sermon that, like, it was me preaching, and I asked, who's the head of the church? You know, is Jason Kenny, Dina Hinshaw, is the lead pastor, or the elders? No, it's the Lord Jesus Christ. And they actually had that excerpt on their mainstream media, you know, 6 p.m. news. And we were just like invigorated. We just could not believe that they would choose to use that excerpt. And so that was a week of turmoil, because we sensed things were heating up. But that moment put some wind in our sails to go like, this is amazing. Like, the Lordship of Christ is being heralded on mainstream television, you know? So from that point forward, things were pretty hot. I mean, we had the mainstream media at our church filming. They weren't inside, but they were across the street taking video, taking photo. And we had the RCMP coming, and we had AHS coming, and so things were beginning to heat up. And so there was a Sunday, and I can't remember which one, but we were waiting to see what the mainstream media was going to do next, because things, for whatever reason, that week were even heating up all the more. We drafted this public statement, the statement that wasn't intended to be theological. We were actually trying to get a message out to Albertans so they would understand what we're doing and where we're coming from, and that we're not approaching this from the vantage point of being selfish. And we just think that our meeting is at the cost of the public good and the public health. And so we address things more practically, more politically at that time. And that too seemed to sort of escalate things a little bit, because now we were actually publicly making a statement that was addressing the science, the medicine, what was happening in our society and province. And then, you know, I think shortly thereafter, in fact, it may have been that Sunday, it was my first arrest. So that would have been February 7th. And that was basically an arrest and release. They arrest me with an undertaking. In the undertaking was a condition that I abide by the Public Health Act. I told them I can't do that. This took place at our church, in our church office. My wife was present. A number of our elders were present. And I just said, I can't do that. They said, that's fine. They indicated on the undertaking, refused to sign. And then they said, we'll be back next week, which was kind of humorous because they were assuming we would be back next week too. And then February 14th was kind of another December 20th moment where I had preached on Romans 13 already, but I wanted to address it from a different angle. So I preached the sermon directing government to its duty, which was the one that went, you know, even more viral than the other. And then was subsequently asked to go into the RCMP on Tuesday of that week because Monday was a holiday. And I think the RCMP officer assumed that I'd go in, I'd be brought before a justice of the peace, I'd get a condition, I'd sign the condition and go home. But when I got that condition, it was, again, I have to comply with the Public Health Act, which would mean I'm giving up my responsibility as a pastor to care for the whole flock, and would be ultimately surrendering the headship of Christ to the governing authorities. And so I couldn't sign that condition. That resulted in me being imprisoned, and I was in prison for 35 days.
Yes. And after you were finally released, what happened then to your church?
Yeah, that was a rough Sunday. So I was released, and so, you know, I'm adjusting to life and all that's taken place, because you can understand that I mean, even the fact that you and I are having this conversation is evidence that when I was in prison, the impact of that went far and wide. What's really interesting about that is, as we were sort of seeing the trajectory, and it was a very kind of orderly progression. So I had lots of time to prepare for the prospect of being arrested and imprisoned and everything. So we tried to assess what will be the impact of my arrest on our province. And we were trying to figure out, like, would it wake people up and that kind of a thing. So we were trying to think about it from that perspective. We never anticipated that it would have the impact that it did within the evangelical church abroad, that it would garner so much attention. That was completely, we never calculated that. And so never saw that coming. And so coming out, my world had changed quite a bit. Obviously, I was adjusting to being out of prison, and then adjusting to, you know, an email inbox that was just inundated with emails from everywhere, and requests and media and everything else. And so that first Sunday was going to be somewhat celebratory in a sense, although you can actually see online my welcome back moment. And I didn't come into that moment sort of, you know, cheering and celebrating in a way that would sort of be heroic. I came into that moment very honest and genuine about what was going on in my life at that time. But what was really interesting is that Sunday, after 5 weeks of being in prison and the RCMP and AHS not coming into our building, they wanted back into our building that day. And so I had just gotten out of jail, and we're in like the mechanical room where we pray right before the service. And I find out RCMP wants back in the building. And so I had a moment right before I stepped out to do our service where I'm just having to go, oh, wow, like they're back and they want in. And it was a tough moment for sure. Because it wasn't, at that point in time, it's getting selective. Why are you staying out of our building for the 5 weeks I'm in prison and then coming in when I'm back? So anyway, they tried to get back into our building. There's video of our guys actually resisting them and saying, no, you're not coming in. We have a section in our criminal code 176 that precludes them from coming in. And so we were able to keep them out. And that was the precursor, I think, to them locking us out of our building. It was the following Wednesday that they, you know, raided our building and fenced it and changed the locks and shut us out. And so since then, we've been out of our building and have been gathering at undisclosed locations. I can tell you that there was one Sunday, it was the Sunday of Tim's first arrest. So Tim Stevens is currently in prison right now in Calgary in remand. And so we'll talk about that, I'm sure, at some point in time here. But his first arrest that Sunday, had we met at the location that we had met at previously for, I think, either 2 or 3 Sundays, it's likely that we would have been arrested, and potentially our whole leadership. And so we avoided that because we kind of knew they were on to us at that location, and we thought, well, we better move. And so we did. And so we were able to avoid that. It's possible the RCMP is extending to us a little bit of grace because I think they knew where we were already, but didn't like do anything about it. It was kind of like, had we gone back there again, we'd really be forcing their hand. And so we were somewhere else that Sunday and avoided that. But we've been meeting at undisclosed locations, doing outdoor gatherings. It really has been wonderful, to be honest with you. I mean, I can tell your listeners now that July 1st, we just found out through the mainstream media, no less, that we're going to be getting our building back. And so July 1st is Canada Day for us. And so we're going to get our building back on July 1st. And we don't think that we're going to meet inside at least that first Sunday. We think we're going to get right out on our lawn, get a big tent and do an outdoor gathering, invite all of Edmonton. In fact, we'll invite all of Alberta to come to this gathering and And we've just really enjoyed these outdoor gatherings that we've had. And when we go back into our building, because of our growth, we're going to have to go to 2 services to make this thing work, which is like not something that we relish doing at all. We really don't. So by meeting on our lawn, our front lawn, as it were, we'd be able to stay together a little longer in one gathering. And that's our preference for sure.
Well, challenging times, but praise the Lord, you're getting your building back. And so your church even grew in this period of time?
Yeah, we were averaging before COVID-19 hit about 350. So like that'd be an annual average. So you have some highs like 380, some lows like 320. So we were at 350. As we were getting closer to my imprisonment, our attendance was getting up into like the 410s, 420s. I think we got as high as 425. And then when I was imprisoned, our church ballooned to like, 600, 700. We were actually eclipsing our fire code capacity. And so that was taking place. In our outdoor gatherings, the number fluctuates a little bit. Like we the last couple of Sundays have had like 460, 450. And so we don't really know exactly where we're at right now. And actually, we wouldn't mind that number coming down to a number that allows us to meet in one service, because that would be preferable. So we'll see what happens. I think if we do an outdoor gathering on our property, that will help give us an idea of what the new normal is going to be. And then we'll know for sure whether we need 2 services or not.
Yeah. So when you were in prison, and also when you were locked out of your church, how did you, your family, your church, how did you handle the situation, and how did you experience the Lord's help? Is there anything you have learned through this experience?
Well, I think the way that the church responded was that it really brought us together. It united us. Now, I was not necessarily a part of that, at least the part of my imprisonment, because I was obviously removed from the body. But it really brought our people together. And if there were any folks in our church who were not convinced we were doing the right thing, or were hesitant about the stance that we were taking, that kind of sealed the deal. And so if there were any stragglers in our group, that they came back after that with a vengeance. And so I think it really brought our body together. I think that it increased our love for each other. As I understand it, those gatherings while I was in prison were really sweet and wonderful worship gatherings, fellowship. So I think that took place, and that has to be God's grace working in our church, that as we suffered, he was there to bless us and strengthen us and encourage us. As far as my family is concerned, this has been what we were living. And again, it was very progressive and orderly. And so we had lots of time to think through it, work through it, talk about it, anticipate the next move, know kind of what was coming and all the rest of it. So, I think it was hard, but it was good and beneficial. And we know Romans 8:28, I mean, that is a wonderful promise. We take it for granted, but God literally causes all things to work together for our good, to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so, the Lord did that. And obviously, my wife, she's a woman that loves the Lord, is fully supportive of me in ministry. And, it's almost like, she would have gone to seminary without me, and she wasn't in seminary, obviously, but she's just been really committed, really supportive. And so she just pressed into the Lord, and the Lord gave her grace to be my mouthpiece while I was in prison. And we just, the Lord just gave us grace, for me on the inside in prison. The Lord, we read Psalm 139, whether I make my bed in heaven or in Sheol, you're there. Well, the Lord's there in prison as well. And I got to experience him being with me in prison, just like I get to experience him being with me now. And I could see that in my interactions with the inmates or with the guards. and could just see what the Lord was doing even on the outside, and the way my wife would minister to me. And then even, I mean, I got letters from all over the place. I got letters from Germany, you know, and I mean, I got to be honest, like that was shocking to get a letter from Germany where someone in Germany is appalled at what's happening in Canada. And I know, you know, things have come a long way since World War II, but it just kind of was shocking in some respects that was taking place. But we had so many letters coming in, and they were a huge encouragement to me and put wind in my sail. And so as the effect of this was just basically spreading like wildfire, we were seeing the Lord was really using this, and that he was accomplishing something significant, where people were getting saved in some cases, others were being sanctified. I mean, it was impacting even the holiness of our church. There were men who were laying aside childish things and were, you know, recognizing the need to put sin to death in their life with greater vigor. And so when we saw the impact of this, you know, you realize the Lord is doing something here, and then you feel just privileged that the Lord would even use you for something like that. I mean, you have to realize, Tobias and your listeners, like, I'm just a guy from Canada. You know, I went to the Master's Seminary. Lots of guys go to the Master's Seminary. I've been in ministry preaching the word. I mean, there's nothing special about me. So why in the world the Lord chose to use our church to be this beacon of light internationally? I mean, I don't know. It could have been any other church, and he chose to use us. So then you just feel immensely privileged. And so yeah, we're just so thankful to have gone through this, and we know that there's likely more war and battle to come, even though we might get a bit of reprieve here in the summertime. And we're ready to stand. We're prepared to stand. And that's one of the things when I think about churches that aren't open right now, things are heating up. And in our country, they're hitting it from every angle. I mean, we've got a bill that was passed. It hasn't gone through the Senate yet, but it was passed, where it's going to regulate the internet. I mean, just think about that. So the government drives you to online ministry and then puts out a bill that's going to regulate the internet. So move you to online and then kill you, basically, right? You know, so in terms of what's coming, I mean, we've got conversion therapy bills where you're going to be guilty of hate speech and a hate crime for speaking out against certain, you know, sinful expressions of sexual immorality. And so, like, things are heating up on multiple levels here in our country. And I don't think some of these churches that are opting not to be open, that they're going to be able to stand. And even if the pastors are willing to stand, their people aren't going to be able or willing to stand. And so this has strengthened us. We've got a backbone. We've got a spine that's Lord willing made of steel. And so we're ready to take the stand that's going to have to be taken at each point along the way as things heat up in our country.
Yes. And as you already mentioned, you really were and are a beacon of light also to us. Also, members in our church were sanctified, were encouraged by your faithfulness. So you already talked a little about how you were encouraged by other Christians, that you received letters. And have there also been discouragement by Christians?
You know what? I've been fairly sheltered from discouragement. I mean, I probably get the majority of it through my wife, who has a social media presence. I don't have a social media presence. I don't have Facebook. I don't have Twitter. And so, you know, I might have seen some stuff that was written in the comment thread on mainstream media articles about us that were less than flattering. But for the most part, I've been somewhat sheltered from that. I mean, I have had a couple of letters that have been sent to me that would be in the group of letters that were supposed to be an encouragement, and it's someone telling me they disagree with me. But to be honest with you, I mean, when you take the stand that we have, and you get the assault that we did from the mainstream media, and you've got all of the vitriol and even the negativity coming from professing Christians, I mean, you come to the place where you just don't really care. You are doing what you believe is right in the Lord's sight. He is the one that you're going to stand before at the judgment seat. You just don't really care what someone else thinks about what you're doing. I certainly care about what our elders think. I care about what our congregation thinks. And there are certainly men that I look to and respect that their support is really important to me. But when push comes to shove and it's time to obey the Lord, you just obey him and you let the chips fall where they may. And so I can't say there's been a ton of discouragement. I think at times I've been discouraged by the state of our country and our province when I look at the general public and the lack of response in some ways to what's taking place. I find that discouraging because that has implications for our long-term trajectory and where we're going. But I would say there hasn't been a ton of discouragement in that way.
Mm. I would like to talk briefly about some critique you might get, and we also get in Germany. And maybe you could just give a brief theological assessment. Of course, we don't have time to elaborate on that a lot, but I have three accusations you normally hear in Germany, and I guess you also hear them in Canada. So maybe you can just briefly reply to that. You know, one critique would be, well, is it not important for you to protect others or to save lives? So why are you gathering and putting people into risk?
Well, I think to even ask that question basically assumes that everything you've been hearing from the government is accurate, and all of the so-called medicine and science that has shaped their response to COVID-19 is accurate, true, factual, evidence-driven, and so I think it's just on its head. It's the wrong question. You know, I think right now what you're seeing in society, and possibly there in Germany, certainly here in Canada, is that this idea of public health is being raised up to be like the sacred cow of society, and so everything needs to bow to this whole concept of public health. What people need to realize is that they're going to lose their liberty to public health. They ought to be willing to sacrifice public health for their liberty. How can I say this? I don't want public health. I think public health is a concept that is evil in its origin, that the government is using something that sounds noble to be the gateway to bring in all kinds of evil and wickedness. And so I would say that when we look at the actual science and medicine surrounding COVID-19, the government response to COVID-19, we can tell people factually that we are not putting our community in jeopardy. In fact, if we didn't meet and didn't shine the light on the injustice and on the lies that are driving this so-called pandemic, that would be more detrimental to public health in the real sense. Because the greatest threat to public health right now, in the truest sense, is the government. It's the government response. It's in our case, AHS and the health agency that is driving everything. And so that would be my response to that. I think when it comes to the protecting of others, the measures the government have put in place is completely unnecessary. The lockdown measures are unproven to do anything to mitigate the spread of the virus. All we're seeing right now take place both in the spring and the fall is the normal spike that you see in flu season. And so when the flu season arrives and lockdowns come in and you see the spike and it comes down and the government goes, look at us, we were effective, you did it, way to go. No, that's just the normal flu season. That's just how the flu works. And so it's disingenuous at the outset to even kind of pose that question, because that question assumes everything that you're being fed is accurate.
Yeah. Well, another critique could be, is this unbiblical rebellion against the state? Shouldn't we submit? What about Romans 13? Is this a call for anarchy?
Yeah, well, so Romans 13 clearly demonstrates all authorities from God. That means all authority is delegated. If authority is delegated, it's limited. God has a purpose for governing authorities. That purpose is to punish evil doing and to praise those who do good. God defines what is good. God defines what is evil. If he puts in place the governing authorities, they are to govern in accordance with his word. And so at the outset, we have to recognize that it's the authority government has is not total, that there are spheres of authority, and the government needs to stay in its lane. You've got the authority of government, the authority of the church, the authority of the family. When it comes to the church and its worship, that is sacred. That is directed by Christ. It's stipulated by his word. And so a leadership is to come together and ensure the word of God is shaping the worship of the church. The government has no authority or expertise, for that matter, to be able to tell the church how it ought to worship. And so it's an overreach of authority. Romans 13 does not give the government the authority, the ability to tell the church how to worship, and nor does a virus. Just because there's a virus that's present, it doesn't create this unusual set of circumstances whereby now the government does have the authority to tell the church how to worship. No, the government can give us information to help us make good and healthy and wise decisions. But when it comes to making calls about how we gather, that is a responsibility that takes place within the context of the church under the headship of Christ by the leadership of that church.
Yeah. Maybe last question, last critique. Is this persecution? Maybe just to give you small information, we recently heard from a well-known Bible teacher here in the German-speaking world who said, well, this is not persecution. If it is, it's persecution of restaurants. So what would your assessment be? Is this persecution of restaurants or of the church?
Well, so I think, to be honest with you, let's just talk about the word persecution. 2 Timothy 3:12, I believe it is. All who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. The lexical definition of that word is to experience oppression for one's beliefs. So we believe that the church ought to function with sovereignty over its worship, that the government has no ability to tell us how to worship. We believe that to submit to the governing authorities at this point in time is to submit to Caesar and to give up Christ's headship over the church. We believe that. And we've been walking in that belief, because belief that isn't practically lived out isn't truly belief. So we believe certain things and we're walking in light of that belief. And because of that, what are we experiencing? Oppression. So that meets the lexical definition of what persecution is. We are being oppressed for our beliefs. And so, I think I could say that, yes, we meet the definition of persecution. Now, having said that, we can look at society and we can go, let's look at China. There's a religious sect of Muslims in China who are being oppressed for their beliefs. They're being persecuted. The persecution isn't limited as a concept to Christians. Being oppressed for your beliefs doesn't just take place in the context of the church. So if we go to the restaurant, for example, the restaurant owner, I guess there might be a case that can be made that if the restaurant owner doesn't believe the government has the authority to tell him he can't work, and if he can even appeal to the word of God, which says you don't work, you don't eat, and he believes on that basis that he must work and he experiences oppression, then I think we might be able to say that, yes, you're right, the restaurant owner is being persecuted. But the whole discussion is irrelevant, because what someone's doing in that whole dynamic is they're trying to say, well, this is not persecution, and therefore, because it isn't, we have to submit to the governing authorities. No, it doesn't work like that. Persecution results from obeying Christ. You comply with the state, you'll never experience persecution. And so we are obeying Christ. We're not trying to figure out when the threshold of persecution is reached. We're simply saying, what is Christ calling us to do? And then we're walking in that obedience, and persecution is coming as a result of that. So the entire question itself as a critique is just like built on this notion that if it were persecution, well, then all of the churches ought to open. And that's just the wrong rubric to figure out what you ought to be doing at this juncture, because you can just comply the whole way home and there will never be any persecution from the state.
So true. Totally agree. Maybe a few last questions. You have already mentioned Tim Stephens. Can you briefly talk about other cases of persecution or repressions in Canada?
Well, yeah, let's talk about Tim Stephens. So Tim Stephens is a faithful man of God. He is a brother. He is a man that I love dearly. He's a friend, wonderful family, and he's been faithful. I believe that what's happening to Tim Stephens is a vendetta. It's retribution. He has embarrassed our governing authorities, and I believe the governing authorities have singled him out on purpose to even the score, as it were. They were embarrassed previously in his wrongful arrest, and that came out. He's been very outspoken with respect to our governing authorities. In fact, he did a video that released June 10th, which was if I have it correct, it was the Thursday prior to the Monday of his arrest, where he spoke out against our premier and this sort of this Sky Palace restaurant saga, where he was photographed having a meal with his coworkers, his colleagues, that wasn't following the health guidelines that he had put in place. And so Tim was giving an interview to Rebel News, which is not mainstream media, but conservative media here in Canada. And I would not be shocked. I would not be shocked if that video was the precursor to his arrest. And to kind of expose this even further, there are a lot of churches that are open in Alberta, and they're not getting the attention that Tim and I have gotten. And so what's going on in those contexts is AHS is kind of testing the water, it would seem, to see if those churches have the backbone necessary to stand up to them. Because there are churches that were open earlier in the whole thing that as soon as the pressure came, whether it was the mainstream media or whatever else, they backed off. The churches closed down. So I think what they've done with GraceLife and Fairview, which is Tim's church, is they've figured out that, okay, these are the poster boys that we have to kind of, bring into submission. They failed to bring us into submission. They've failed to bring Tim into submission, but they're not going after anybody else at this point in time because we're the ones that are in the limelight. And so they're just enforcing against us and making it look like, we're like a sect. We're like some religious sect. We're idiosyncratic. We're not the norm for, churches in Alberta. Meanwhile, there's tons of churches that are open and they know it. They know it. So what's going on with Tim is selective. I think it is vengeance, and it's unjust. To be clear, he is in prison right now for violating a court order that doesn't even apply to him. And to illustrate that it doesn't, he's in Calgary. So he's got the Calgary Police Services. We're in an area outside of Edmonton. So we have the RCMP. The RCMP will not enforce the court order that's being used to hold Tim in prison right now. AHS went to the RCMP to get the RCMP to enforce that court order from May 6th that doesn't apply to anyone but this one restaurant. And the RCMP said, no, get another court order. And AHS went and got another court order, and they ended up shutting down that protest rodeo that was going to take place. And so he's in prison right now on a court order that doesn't even apply to him. That's how unjust this is. And so we're trying to get him out of there. There was a rally for him this past Saturday. There's another one coming up this coming Saturday. And we want to get him out. It's possible that he'll be released on July 1st, when everything else gets released, because even his building should be returned to him at that point in time too. Every church, every restaurant that's currently seized by AHS is supposed to be released on July 1st. And that's because the health orders are going to be rescinded. The health orders are the things that are keeping us from having access to our building. But yeah, he's doing well, as I understand it. He and I talked on Monday. All things considered, he's doing well. But his imprisonment is, I would say, even more unjust than mine. Even more. Yeah. Even more shocking, to be honest with you.
Yes.
And then beyond Tim, like there's Jacob Riome. He's taken a lot of heat in Ontario. He's going to be here in Alberta on Saturday. And so he's taken quite a lot of heat. Steve Richardson, another guy who's taken a strong stand that you guys know. And he's been a wonderful brother, and he's going through a bit of a difficult season as well. There are lots of men. Aaron Rocks, another guy who has taken his lumps. But yeah, I think in Alberta, it's Tim and I. Tim and I are the guys that have gotten the most attention here, and that's just the way the Lord has seen fit for it to be.
Yes. So, with all this happening, what would your biblical spiritual assessment be? Why do you think this is happening, and what do you think will come in the future? Do you have any thoughts about this?
I will. Let me see if I can't answer that from a Canadian perspective, and then your listeners can assess whether or not that's the same thing that's happening there in Germany. What we're seeing, in my estimation, is that right now there's an effort to do away with Western civilization as we know it. So critical race theory is like the new ideology that is being imposed upon countries. It I think originates with the academic world. It's tied to Marxism, which is, communism and socialism. And so what's going on right now through critical race theory is that the governing authorities are claiming that the system that is the foundation upon which Western civilization exists is inherently racist. So racism is being redefined. It's not so much at this point in time, where an individual is racist toward another individual, although they'll connect that to this systemic racism. But it's saying that the whole Western civilization as we know it is inherently racist. And in fact, it's a system that's founded upon white supremacy. And so what they want to do is they want to do away with Western civilization, which is what? Well, it's going to be, individual liberty. It's going to be, healthy democracy, generally speaking, smaller government, capitalism. And they want to do away with the whole thing, abolish the entire thing, and impose in its place, a more totalitarian government style. And so that's what we're seeing here in Canada, that our prime minister wants to make this more of a communist country. And so all of the steps are taking place right now to regulate everything in order to bring the populace into submission and give the state all of the power it needs to be able to dictate how life ought to be. And so as you see that taking shape, obviously the what the church stands for and represents is going to be, they're going to attempt to stamp it out and silence it and remove it even more from society than it already is. And so it's hard to know whether or not they're going to be successful, because if you look at the US right now, the pushback is significant. I mean, there is significant pushback. I've looked at the US for a long time and thought to myself, man, I almost think in some ways they're further gone than we are. In this season with with regard to COVID-19 and even the pushback happening right now, I'm realizing the US is actually in a better place than we are. That country's got a lot of chaos going on. The crime is just crazy, especially in certain cities. But the judicial system, as well as the populace of the US, is showing they have more of a backbone than Canada. We have rolled over in Canada. I mean, our people have just rolled over, and they're willing to give up their civil liberties or just hope this thing goes away. They're gonna sell their civil liberties for a vaccine, and it's just, they're just giving up everything that was purchased in World War II. So I don't know if they're going to be successful in this. I mean, I'm a futuristic premillennialist, so I have a somewhat pessimistic eschatology, but I'm not omniscient. And so I'm not trying to, read the newspaper to figure out what's happening next and how close we are to the Lord's return. So it's conceivable that we could still have a reprieve, a conservative pushback here in our country, and we could get our prime minister out and get somebody more conservative in. That's possible. But unless the trajectory that we're currently on is interrupted, Canada is going to be heading into a very totalitarian, communist style of government. I think you're seeing the same thing happen in Australia. I think the same thing is happening in Britain. And so it would seem like the Commonwealth countries are kind of the testing ground just to see, whether they can reverse Western civilization as we know it. And in the process, there's no question the church they're going to attempt to stamp it out through legislation, through hate crimes and hate speech and everything else, by outlawing the scriptures and preaching and all of that. So, I don't know what's going to happen ultimately, but the outlook right now is bleak, barring a change in trajectory.
Right. So even if this current crisis comes to an end, we should be prepared for the next wave, basically.
Yeah, and that wave may not be COVID-19. It's possible that COVID-19, they've accomplished what they wanted to accomplish with that virus. They found out what they needed to find out as far as the people of each country and how they're going to respond and who are going to be the ones that push back. But yeah, the next wave may be something even more sinister. And yeah, we got to be ready.
Right. Well, in light of this, do you have a message to those churches, pastors, Christians who believe that the state only wants to protect us and that we should comply with every state order? Do you have any words to those Christians?
Yeah, I would say that those Christians are incredibly naive. They're incredibly out of touch with reality. They're ill-informed. They're not thinking critically. They don't have access to information that would help them to understand what's happening in our society and culture with greater clarity. And so I would say that they really need to wake up. They're failing to see and realize what's happening. And if you wanted to tie it to theology, we understand that this is Satan's world system. I mean, this is Satan's world system, and his world system is whereby he organizes mankind in rebellion against God. So Satan, under the sovereignty of God, is permitted to organize man in rebellion against God. And when you look at what's happening in our society, everything built into God's design in creation is being attacked. Marriage, the children, gender, everything. You just look at every ism. It's rebellion against God. And I would say this, you have all these phobias. Our world is Christophobic. And every phobia is a phobia created because of how Christophobic our world is. And they ought to be Christophobic, because unless they're reconciled to God through Christ, he is their judge, and he is going to be ruthless when he brings judgment upon them for their unrighteousness. But I would say they're naive. They're not thinking critically. They're out of touch with reality. They need to wake up. Hopefully they wake up at some point in time. Hopefully there's a trigger point for them where they go, oh, we missed it. Those guys were right. We've been asleep at the wheel. But if they wanted to tether it to theology, they need to realize this is Satan's world system. Wake up. They're not there for your good. And so anyway, that'd be my charge to them.
Yes. And what can Christians in Germany do for Christians in Canada and also to prepare themselves?
Well, I think to prepare yourself both individually and corporately, you've got to cultivate obedience to Christ. You've got to cultivate obedience to him in your personal walk, your daily living. You know, if you are not walking in integrity personally, in your mind, in your heart, in your private time, in your private life, then when it comes time to stand, you're not going to be able and prepared to do that. So it begins with cultivating personal obedience to Christ, and certainly corporate obedience to Christ as local churches. And I think that's the place you want to be, and the Lord's going to work in your life to prepare you for what he has for you with respect to suffering. As far as what Christians in Germany can do for the church here in Canada, I think you can obviously be praying for us, giving visibility to what's taking place. I think you can contact our politicians. It's just support us. I mean, to know that there are Christians in Germany that have our back prayerfully is such a blessing, and that you're able to see from your country what's happening in our country for what it is, when even guys in our own country are can't see it, and they want to hit the snooze button on everything. I just think keep us in prayer, cultivate personal obedience, and just seek to be faithful to Christ. Yes.
Well, do you have any final words of exhortation or encouragement? I mean, those were already sort of final words, but if you have anything to add.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus is Lord, and he is good. He is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is sovereign over all things. Everything is working toward him being glorified to the glory of the Father. Our responsibility is to be faithful in the meantime and to walk in obedience to him. And so in the end, we know Christ wins. And because Christ wins, we win. And our responsibility in the meantime is to be willing to go through whatever suffering he would have for us, and to recognize that even as we go through that, it's just a signal that we have eternal joy on the horizon, because we've been counted worthy to suffer for his name's sake. And so Jesus is Lord, and we got to take great courage and comfort in that.
Amen. Thank you so much, brother. It was a great pleasure and honor talking to you. We will continue to pray for you and your family and your church and all faithful brothers and sisters in Canada. And may the Lord strengthen you and comfort you and fill you with peace and joy, and richly reward you for your faithfulness and the example you set for Christians everywhere. So thank you very much for the interview, and God bless.
Thanks, Pastor Tobias. Appreciate you. God bless you.